European electricity. My name is Kate Abnett. I'm the European climate and energy correspondent for Reuters, joining you today from Brussels. I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar where for the next hour, we're going to be talking about the key findings from Ember's electricity review, freshly published today. It's the first comprehensive overview of the EU power system in 2024, and it provides some fascinating insights into where Europe is in its clean energy transition and what we can expect from the next stage of that transition this year. So, in our discussion today, we will hear perspectives from politics, business, and finance on how Europe can accelerate its shift to clean electricity. The panel of experts will also answer some questions from you in a Q&A at the end, so please do start sending them in. If you have a question, you can share it in writing using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. A bit of housekeeping before we get going. This webinar is being recorded. It will be uploaded to the Ember website after the event. The report is available on Ember's website at ember-energy.org. And if you're posting about the report on social media, please use the hashtag EER25. So before we get into our panel discussion, we have the team from Ember with us who are going to present their key findings from the European Electricity Review, which analyzes electricity generation and demand in the 27 EU countries. I am very glad to be joined by Chris Roslow, Senior Energy Analyst at Ember, Beatrice Petrovic, Senior Energy and Climate Analyst, and Leo Haberer, Data Analyst at Ember. Chris, I'll hand over to you to present your findings.
Thanks so much, Kate. Just bear with me 1 second while I share the slides for today's presentation. Okay, you should be able to see those now. So the next 15 minutes or so, we'll give you a quick recap of what happened in the EU power sector in 2024. All the key numbers there for you to take away and digest. And then we've picked 3 insights to go for a slightly deeper dive. And we'll finish with a few words on Ember's data, which is what most of this is based off. And of course, is provided alongside the report and is open and freely available as always. I just want to start straight away with some key messages from this year's review. We found that the transition to clean power continued at pace in the EU, and this was despite some challenging economic and political conditions, and also a small recovery in power demand, which we'll get into. Solar continued to grow at the speed of light, as we're used to by now, but we think it's important to say that the clean flexibility growth will be needed to sustain that growth in solar going forwards. When it comes to wind power, the growth was a bit less impressive this year than recent years. It still remains the EU's second largest power source after nuclear and ahead of gas. We think there are some early signs that the challenges may be blowing over for the wind sector, but more action is certainly needed to grow to close a delivery gap between the current outlooks and EU targets, and for many other reasons as well. And the final key message, I think, is this year we produced some what I think are very powerful new numbers on the savings to the EU's fossil import bill as a result of growth in wind and solar, and we'll get into those numbers very shortly as well. So now I have three key numbers that really sum up what we found this year in 2024. The first is this great milestone of solar power passing coal power for the first time in the EU. This means that coal is exiting the system very quickly, as you can see, and of course solar continues its very, very impressive rise. The second key number is this year, gas power in the EU declined again, and that was the 5th annual decline in a row. So we think this essentially indicates that gas power has entered a phase of structural decline in the EU. And together with the decline in coal power, the EU's power sector emissions have fallen now to half of their peak from 2007. Fossil power overall is a historic low. Actually, it's at the lowest level since records began more than 40 years ago. The third key number is on the rise of renewables altogether. So renewables now provide nearly half of EU power, and that's up from a third as recently as 2019 at the start of the European Green Deal. Now, this slide gives you a snapshot of the changes in generation by power source in 2024 compared to the year before. We can see, like I just mentioned, that solar was the fastest growing source yet again in the EU. On top of that, we had further rebounds in hydropower and nuclear power, which also grew this year. And they essentially completed their rebounds from a few years of underperformance back to normal levels. All that added together meant that we saw a steep decline in fossil power across both coal and gas. And as I mentioned, this was despite a small rebound in power demand, which for the first time after a few years of declining sharply, power demand across the EU increased by just 1%. So I think it's too early to say whether this is marks a new era of increasing power demand, but this is certainly a change compared to recent years. Now it's time for the first of our 3 insights that I mentioned that this year's report goes into in a bit more detail. We thought as we enter 2025, we're halfway to 2030. It's a good point to reflect on the progress that's been made in the power sector over the course of the Green Deal for these last 5 years. And that progress, I think you'll agree, is quite significant. So these 4 points really highlight kind of 4 key achievements in the power sector over this time period. So we've seen the share of wind and solar in the EU's power mix has almost doubled from 17 to 29%. And that's the main reason why the fossil share has decreased so far from 39% to 29% in just 5 years. And the next 2 points actually relate a bit more to the implications of this for Europe's energy security. So obviously a major event over this time period was the Russian attack on Ukraine, which caused gas prices to soar and left the EU scrambling to replace those imports of Russian gas. But the power sector actually helped in this challenge because the power sector reduced the EU's overall consumption of gas. We think the power sector was responsible for around a third of the reduction in gas demand, which fell 20% overall compared to a few years ago. And indeed, without the growth in wind and solar over these 5 years, we find that the EU would have had to import additional fossil fuels for power generation, which would have cost it around 59 billion euros. So this just goes to show the extent to which this wind and solar growth has helped energy security in Europe over this period. You might be wondering how we calculated this 59 billion number. All the details are in the reports, but basically it wasn't straightforward. We looked at quite detailed capacity data in wind and solar, and we used hourly generation data in every country for every fuel source for the past 5 years. It was quite an undertaking, so we're particularly pleased with that number in this year's report. So my final slide before I hand over to my colleague is just on where this leaves coal and gas in the EU. We can see quite clearly here that coal is being pushed out of the system rather rapidly. It's fallen from being the 3rd largest power source in the EU to the 6th largest in just 5 years. And it's increasingly marginal. 10 member states are now coal-free in their power sector, and 6 more just use very small amounts of coal. So the majority, it's marginal or absent. I think on the gas side of the equation, this is a bit more interesting for Europe's energy security. So I've already mentioned that the transition to clean power has really helped the EU reduce its gas consumption and decouple from Russian gas supplies. But the EU is still importing Russian gas, and we estimate that 12% of gas power was actually fueled by Russian gas this year. So there's more work to do. At the same time, Europe has increased its reliance on liquefied natural gas. And we think this presents an economic risk because these markets are inherently volatile. Currently, LNG is expensive and these markets are inherently volatile. But as well as economic risks, this also exposes the EU to political risks. We've seen that Donald Trump is already trying to coerce the EU into buying more LNG. So yeah, basically the faster that the EU can reduce its gas consumption further, we think this transition is fully aligned with these 3 key objectives of the new EU leadership to improve energy affordability, improve energy security, and of course, continue the drive to decarbonize. So with that, I'll hand over to my colleague Beatrice to go through the final 2 insights.
Okay, so thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. So pleasure to introduce the first insight, which is dedicated to the fastest growing electricity source last year, which was solar, as has been said already. So last year was a record year for solar in the EU. As you can see from the chart to the right, really it marked a record annual increase in solar generation, and solar produced 22% more compared to the year before. This led really electricity generation from solar panel hitting a historic high. And note that this include as far as we can, and we did a lot of good effort to have the best data for that. It includes also solar electricity that is produced by small scale installations, such as those that are installed on the roofs of houses and factories around the EU. So this increase was due to a record amount of new solar capacity addition across the EU. And we found that sustaining this current pace of growth would bring the EU 2030 solar target within reach. So what is very special about this solar success story, this is not just one country's story. If you look at last year data, solar have been growing widespreadly. It actually has been growing in every EU country. Solar, as you can see from the map, is generating more than 10% of electricity in 16 countries, and this is 3 more than the year before. And there are countries that are doing even more than that. So if you see, there are countries such as Hungary, Greece, Spain, and Cyprus are generating more than a fifth of their electricity from solar panels. This impressive growth in solar fleet across the EU means that solar is increasing, meeting and higher than ever share of our demand. So the share of demand covered by solar alone is as high as 80% of the demand at peak production time in top solar countries. So this hour with abundant solar generation are becoming more frequent across the EU. And this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to further reduce this reliance on expensive and volatile fossil power, but only if solar growth will be paired with accelerated rollout of batteries, with smart electrification, and an expanded grid infrastructure. So note that these solutions are also good because they help consumers to benefit from cheap and abundant solar beyond the sunny hours. And these are also the solutions that will help, as we mentioned at the beginning, to sustain the solar growth going forward. So next insight is dedicated to wind power. Because if solar was the fastest growing power source last year, wind is the one which is set to accelerate this year, already 2025. So if we look back, so last year, wind power remained the EU's second largest power source, delivering more electricity than gas once again. And if you see, it continued an upward trend, both in terms of total generation that you can see to the left, but also in terms of installed capacity. However, the growth last year has been slower compared to the previous year. There are many drivers behind this slower growth of wind. Some are related to macroeconomic challenges such as high inflation, supply chain problems. Some others, however, were really made in Europe and connected to barriers such as slow permitting of new projects, slow development of grid, and also slow connection of this new project to the grid. And these are all domestic policy barriers that really limited the opportunity for growth. So, however, good news is that last year was also the year when these challenges started to be tackled. In particular, there were many policy changes that were taken at EU level in the first 5 years of the European Green Deal that are really starting to show results. So there are 2 data points that I'd like to share with you that really, I think they show that how wind generation can and is likely to accelerate this growth. So the first one really tackle a key policy barrier. So last year, we saw an increase in wind project approvals. This was mainly observed in Germany, which was one of the few countries that actually implemented permitting reforms. And this really shows that when the right policies are implemented, and we already have them, you see a real impact. The second data point I want to draw your attention to is that despite the inflationary pressure that we mentioned, the many wind auctions that were held last year confirmed that wind can really deliver electricity at a significantly lower cost than gas. And this is very important because gas is typically the fuel that sets the price in EU wholesale power market. So accelerating this wind deployment across the EU will really play a key role in decreasing electricity prices across the EU. But acceleration in wind is indeed needed, as we mentioned at the beginning. So while this higher growth is on the horizon, those delays in the recent year have created a widening gap between the market forecast that you can see in this chart as blue lines and EU ambitions, the targets that you see in this chart as red lines. So in short, wind capacity is set to grow, but not enough to hit EU targets. So what could policymakers do to maintain this momentum with the electricity transition and help delivering affordable, reliable, and secure energy for EU families and businesses? So in our report, we highlight 3 top areas for action. The first one is about implementing rules that we already have, implementing them at national level, with a particular focus on doubling the pace of wind development. Second one is about the clean flexibility that we mentioned, so accelerating rollout of energy storage, enhanced grid, and other clean flexibility solutions. This can also be made simply by removing existing barriers that we have. And third, set a strong EU agenda for electrification that has a strong focus on unlocking the opportunities of demand flexibility. So to sum up, so our analysis really show, I think, that the EU electricity transition continued at pace. We also show that there has been, over the last 5 years, significant progress, and also there were benefits that were achieved. This, I think, should build confidence in how much we can achieve in the next 5 years, which are crucial ones to 2030, and how much we can do, we are still empowered to do, to deliver clean, affordable, and secure energy for generations to come. So I hope you find our insights interesting and insightful. We are really happy to take questions after the panel discussion, but now we'll pass over to Leo, who will say a little more about our data.
Thank you, Bea. At Ember, we collect data on electricity generation, net imports, demand, and demand from 16 sources to give you the most accurate picture we can for the EU generation mix in 2024. We provide this data both for yearly generation since 1990 and monthly generation since 2015. There is a full methodology in the report available if you're interested, or you can reach out to us at data@ember-energy.org. Along with this report, we're also providing release files for yearly and monthly generation data for all EU member states, as well as an EU aggregate. Going beyond the EU, we provide similar data for the world at large. We collect yearly data for 214 countries and economic regions, and monthly data for about 80 countries. We update this data set twice a month to make sure that we have the most up-to-date and accurate picture of global generation possible. You can access this via our Data Explorer, which I am showing you right now, or download it directly either from our data catalog or via our API. Besides generation, we also provide a number of specialized data sets, such as an overview of European wholesale electricity prices, a tracker for the latest EU NECP targets, or data on Chinese solar PV exports, to just name a few. Again, feel free to reach out to us if you're interested how this all comes together. Thanks so much. And with that, I will hand it back to Kate.
Thank you all very much. So another year of big milestones for clean energy in Europe. We'll dive straight into our panel discussion now, and I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists. We have Thomas Pellerin-Carlin, French member of European Parliament for the Socialists and Democrats group. Thomas was elected last year, before which he actually worked in research on EU energy and climate policy. So he's an expert on this topic on multiple fronts. Silvia Piana joins us. She is the head of regulatory synergies and strategy at the Italian energy utility Enel. She has more than 20 years of experience in the electricity sector, during which time she has held roles including leading regulatory affairs at Enel Green Power, which is the group's renewable energy arm. Michael Villa is the Executive Director of smartEN, or Smart Energy Europe, a business association focused on demand-side flexibility. Michael is also a member of the Smart Energy Expert Group at the European Commission, which has a mission to speed up the digitalization of the energy system here in the EU. Alfredo Pares is Senior Vice President and Head of Renewables at Hitachi Energy, a technology supplier for the energy sector. He is also Vice Chair of the industry group Wind Europe, and he spent 5 years in China, so brings to our discussion a deep understanding of the Chinese wind industry, a very hot topic in Brussels currently. And finally, Mark Freshney is Head of European Utilities at UBS Utilities Equity Research. Mark brings to our discussion 19 years of experience covering the utility sector at Credit Suisse in London and now at UBS. Thomas, I'm going to come to you first. So Chris talked in his presentation about the cost savings and Ember's findings that without new wind and solar capacity that was added over the last 5 years, the EU would have had to spend around 59 billion euros more on fossil fuel imports. It's a big saving, but we know that for many consumers, energy prices are still painfully high. So I wanted to ask you, how can the EU make sure that in the next phase of the energy transition, consumers are actually feeling the benefits of the shift to clean energy?
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you for Ember for the work you're doing. And indeed, that 59 billion euros of saving is the kind of figure we need to inform the debate we're currently having in the European Parliament. As Kate mentioned, I've spent a decade of my life being a researcher in energy and climate issues, so I'm quite familiar with those numbers, and so that number did not really surprise me. But obviously, a lot of my fellow MEPs, especially freshman MEPs, are somewhat new to those energy topics. And indeed, I think at least I increasingly see the debate moving towards an understanding of renewable energy, especially solar and wind, not only as being necessary from a climate change perspective, but also as being the kind of homegrown energy that we can have to ensure our energy security, and also as a way to provide cheaper, if not cheap, at least cheaper energy for European companies and European families that have been struggling with higher energy prices since 2021 in something that at least I started to call in October 2021 a gas shock, as a reference to the oil shocks we had in 73 and in 79 in Western Europe. So then what can we do moving forward? Obviously, I'm stating the obvious, but the more we can support the deployment of wind and solar generation, the better. I guess that's obvious. I don't need to drill on that. But maybe let me highlight two other things that are critical to make sure that cheaper electricity prices lead to cheaper energy prices. When you look at a household, at a European family, sorry, back when I was working with economists, I used to say households. Now I'm in politics, so I say family, but that's essentially the same thing. For European families, the vast majority of the energy bill is a fossil fuel bill still today. The first energy cost for a family is oil for transportation, by far. And then it's heating. And most of the heating is gas heating or oil heating and even coal heating in countries like Poland or even Austria. And therefore, electricity currently accounts for actually a relatively small share of this. But we know that oil prices and gas prices are not going down. They will remain volatile because of geopolitics, and in the world of bullies where we live in, bully number one, Trump, or bully number two, Putin, or bully number three, Xi Jinping, can all have a big impact on our fossil fuel prices. But they can't really have a massive impact on our electricity prices. Putin can stop, obviously, gas to flow to Europe, but it can't stop the wind from blowing in Normandy or the sun from shining in Sicily. And so therefore, what we need to work on is electrification. More electrification, by and large, means at the same time higher electricity bill, because obviously the more you electrify, the more you consume electricity, but it leads to a largely smaller energy bill. And that's especially the case for the switch from gas heating to heat pumps, or the switch from petrol cars to battery electric cars. And for that, we need to keep the regulation that we have, and that will be an uphill battle in the European Parliament, I can tell you, but we are waging that battle as we speak, and we need to move forward. How we can ensure more electrification of residential industrial heat, but also of the mobility of people and goods, because that's a way to reduce the energy price. Maybe just a final point, we also need to play on our strength. And one of the greatest strengths of the European electricity system is its grid. I often hear people praising the US. I mean, let's be clear, the US can be praised for many things. But when we talk about electricity, I'm sorry, but we are far better than the Americans. Our grid is much better. It is much more secure. The types the type of electricity blackouts that they consistently have in the US, like they had in Texas a couple of years ago, like they've been having in Los Angeles over the past 2 weeks, is something that we don't have in Europe, because we've got a better regulation. We are more integrated. We are more federal in Europe than in the USA when it comes to the electricity grid. So we need to obviously not only maintain this strength, but increase it, reinforce it. And that's what we need: EU equity investment in the electricity grid. We need also to improve our regulation to make sure that we can plan the grid expansion in a way that will deliver cheaper electrons at the end of the day for all Europeans.
Thank you very much, Thomas. So I'm glad you brought up grids, because that is exactly what I wanted to talk to Sylvia about. So the Ember has found that 2024 was a very big year for solar generation. 16 EU countries generated more than 10% of their electricity from solar last year. But Sylvia, we know that as more renewable energy enters the network, it becomes ever more important that the grids are able to handle this. So can you tell us what needs to happen to make sure the EU's grids are ready for the next 5 years of the energy transition?
Sure. Thank you, Kate, and good afternoon. And I'm indeed pleased to note that today, when events are organized to discuss about renewable developments, electricity scenarios, an intervention on distribution grids is planned, because this means that the role of distribution grids in enabling the transition towards a more decarbonized, but also secure, but also affordable, and definitely also competitive electricity system is recognized. And distribution grids indeed face today an incredible challenge, because they no longer simply need to transport electricity from point A to point B, but they need to integrate this massive renewable that you mentioned, that was very well explained at the beginning of this presentation. They also have to cope with the massive increase of electrification of demand, and also with the active participation of customer or families, household in the electricity system. We call them prosumers, we call them smart consumers, as you want, but they need to be able to participate in the electricity system. What is necessary for distribution grids to cope with this challenge? Investments in grid expansion, modernization, digitalization, flexibilization. The Euroelectric flagship report, The Grids for Speed, which is publicly available and was launched last year, highlights that some 55 billion euros per year are necessary at European level for distribution grids. And this figure considers certain regulatory strategies, such as anticipatory investments, considers grid enhancing technologies, and consider grid-friendly flexibility. Flexibility, I must say, has not to be considered as a one-fits-all solution that will per se allow to avoid investments in the physical expansion of the grid, but should be rather considered as a tool that on a cost-benefit base can help to optimize the use, the management, and the investments on the grids.
Sylvia, that's great. Thank you. I'll pick up that thread on flexibility that you mentioned. Michael, one thing that Ember found was that there is going to have to be a lot more policy action to support flexibility tools like batteries and other types of storage if the EU is going to keep up the pace of its growth of renewable energy. So building on what Sylvia mentioned there, what action do you want to see from the EU to incentivize the uptake of demand flexibility?
Thanks a lot. It's extremely important indeed to focus not only on the renewable generation, but on the relevance of demand so that demands can match variable renewable generation in the systems to help them integrate and to reduce the system costs of the clean energy transition. And that's why I appreciate that also Ember is pushing for a smart electrification of the energy systems, not only an electrification of consumption. Because if we have demand increasing electricity consumption, but not in a flexible way, then we are gonna have a huge problem because we need to increase unnecessary investment in grid reinforcement, or we are increasing peaking demands, and so we need to make excessive investment in generation. So this is not gonna be sustainable. And indeed, you are highlighting the good news that electrification is increasing by 1.2%. So an increase of 31 terawatt hour in electricity. But how much of this increase in electricity demand is flexible? Very, very low. So we are lucky in the sense the European Union in the past two legislatures was able to set 70 legislative provisions to activate the flexibility of demand from all consumers, from households to energy-intensive industries. So now is the time to implement, to allow a profitability, a scalability of the business models offered by companies that can provide the services and the technologies for consumers of all types to activate these flexibility. And this is gonna be an extremely important implementation effort that needs to be done in an harmonized way. The flexible demand management industry needs to have harmonized rules, implementation rules across Europe, because they cannot adapt to 27 different frameworks. And it's extremely important to have stability and long-term visibility on the possible remunerations that consumers would have by activating their flexibility. Flexibility needs to be voluntary, needs to be market-based, and consumers of all type needs to have a remuneration. And remuneration are monetary. That could be savings in their energy bills, but also gains because of bidding into markets. So, voilà, that's an extremely important effort that needs to be done. And we need to quantify, we need to specifically monitor the progress. So, indeed, that's why we are very happy that there is going to be an electrification action plan, hopefully, as I was saying, to be a smart electrification action plan. And we need indeed to set specific targets so that, as I was saying before, when there is an electrification, there is an activation of that electricity demand in a flexible way, because it's supporting the system, because it's supporting consumers, because it's supporting the cost-effective transition towards climate neutrality, not the opposite.
Thank you very much. Alfredo, let's talk about the wind sector, which has had a very challenging few years with high inflation, supply chain problems, some of the issues that companies have been up against. Ember's analysis found that there are some early signs of recovery in the industry. So we're seeing more wind farm permitting, we're seeing more turbine orders next year, both positive signs. But what is needed to make sure this recovery continues? What is the sector looking for from the EU and national governments?
Thank you, Kate. And yes, let's celebrate the numbers we achieved back last year, no? In terms of new installation, 15 gigawatts, that's what we achieved. But we need much more than that. We need 30 gigawatts to be installed to reach the EU targets. So definitely a long way to go. So what do we need? Well, let me just highlight and repeat the conclusions of Ember report, because they are spot on. And as an industry, that's what we are pointing to first. I mean, permitting must be addressed. No, we have the new permitting rules, so we know how we want to play permitting going forward in terms of binding timelines of or the overriding interest principles. And Germany show it can work. So they approved 15 gigawatt of new wind farms last year, 7 times more than in the past. So permitting definitely has to remain one of the key demand and ask. The second piece is grids. So thanks, Sylvia, for highlighting the needs on the distribution side. Let me then talk a little bit what we need on the transmission side, because they go together. There's no point to have transmission without distribution, and there's no point to have distribution without transmission. So we need to address those grid connection queues, more than 500 gigawatts in Europe. We need to deliver the grid expansion at the time and when committed. And we need to build this flexibility that has been mentioned several times. And the third element definitely is the electrification piece. And I'm happy to use the word smart electrification, because I think we all agree on that. No, we need to take advantage of the smartness we'll bring in the system with EV storage and smart electrification of industry. All this combined with a holistic view of the overall system, which will help us. So these are like the 3 main topics. But if you can go quickly a bit deeper, we need to look at the supply chain, an EU-based supply chain. So we need to have the rules and the environment ecosystem so that companies can invest. And that is as much as visibility what is coming, but also enabling developers to make long-term commitments. We at Hitachi Energy, we have seen that, and we've committed investment of more than $6 billion. The second piece is the auctions. Auction needs to be with clear rules. We've seen recently in wind, or some of the auctions were not did not get the attention they deserve. So we need to have clarity and rules that attract investors, because eventually this is what's going to build the business case. And specifically on wind, think about repowering. Let's not forget about repowering. We have a huge install base. Let's think about hybridization, combining solar and storage to bring this smartness in the system and support system stability, build offshore grid infrastructure, and don't forget the new technologies like floating.
Thank you very much. So clear rules needed and more investments in European supply chains. Mark, what do investors think about all of this? Solar provided more EU electricity than coal for the first time last year. Gas use declined for the 5th year in a row. There are some rapid changes happening in the power sector in Europe. How are investors responding to that? And also, what's needed to actually maintain investment in renewables at the levels that are needed to reach the EU's climate goals?
No, thank you, and good questions. So how are investors responding to all this? I think the first thing is thermal assets, which is gas and coal-fired generation. For some time, they have traded at a significant discount, reflecting the fact that there's a debate about life limiting them, the CO2 EU ETS charges, the availability of gas. All of these questions mean that there is such an uncertainty as to value that you wouldn't normally value them. I think that moving on to the technologies, I think there's a general understanding or belief that we need something else, right? We've worked very hard to get the LCOE, the levelized cost of solar and wind, down so that they are below the cost, the headline costs of burning fossils. And of course, to get the cost of CO2 emissions up, which is the other part of that equation. But we need something else, right? And that's battery storage, nuclear, CCUS, hydrogen was, thought to be helping to provide flexibility, but I think the costs are considered to be too high. But I think markets realize that you need something else, but are not quite sure as to what that is. I think the other point I would raise is just on deliverability and higher rates. So particularly in offshore, there have been concerns about the deliverability. In onshore, tends to be permitting, but in offshore, it's deliverability of projects and execution, and the costs and the division of risk between supply chain and developers. And I think the industry has a lot more work to do there, showing that it can shorten lead times, fewer delays. But you know, things like 2 days ago, Ørsted taking additional impairments and having execution issues in Sunrise is or costs is a concern. The final point, and this is the big one, is the financing cost. We've got borrowing costs for debt at the highest level for 15 years in UK and US. In Europe, it's at an elevated level. When you build renewable and low carbon solutions, the cost is all up front. And the biggest, or the capex is up front, but the biggest actual cash outflow is what you pay for debt and equity, the return on debt and the return on equity over the 20, 25, 30-year life of the asset. And borrowing costs have spiked. The industry has work to do, bringing the LCOE down. And fundamentally, rates have spiked because markets are telling, you know, an economy to invest less, but we are committed to this energy solution. So look, it's, you know, responding by valuing thermal assets at a very low level. We need something else, and deliverability and financing are what markets are focusing on. The final point that I would come along and add is I think the EU needs to stay at the crease. And what I mean by that is we're partway through a transition. We've got high energy costs driven by gas. So we've got legacy systems driven by gas and coal and carbon, which are expensive. And we're investing in a new system. So in a way, we're doubling up on the cost, right? Very, very simplistic. But at the other end of the tunnel, we get to an electricity system that, you know, is clean and new. So it's, you know, that, you know, we can focus on other things. It's reliable and secure with low cost domestic content and green jobs. So it means that energy cannot be weaponized against us. We have a low fixed cost and we get circularity going in the economy. That's something that's very good. And I think to pause or slow down or stop halfway risks almost stranding us in the middle. And I think there is a big opportunity here to continue on the path that we are.
Thank you very much, Mark. Clear message there to stay the course. So we'll move to questions from our audience now. We've got a question in the chat from Matthew Davids. He asks, as we have more weather-dependent sources of energy brought onto the system, what are feasible and sustainable solutions apart from nuclear? I think he's asking about baseload power there. Bea and Michael, I'd love to hear your views on this. Maybe Bea, you could kick us off.
Sure. Yes, there are many weather-dependent sources, not just wind and solar. And actually, wind and solar together, they complement each other very well because they produce at different time of the day, different times of the year. So first step is just continue to deploy them together. We see in the data that actually renewables are covering higher and higher share of our demand. So it's not that we are, actually we will have an abundancy problem rather than a scarcity problem with wind and solar. So I think just to a bit, just not to sound the alarm too much, but what we see that actually there are solutions that are good to make the most of renewables beyond sunny hours and windy hours, which are the clean flexibility solutions that are already available actually ready to deploy. Batteries have been mentioned, enhanced grid as well, and they do benefit consumers. So I think it's actually a good deal to accelerate their rollout.
Thank you very much. Matthew, what's your view on that? What are the sort of best practice flexibility solutions, storage solutions that can be brought on to balance weather-dependent energy sources?
So consumers, all types, with any consuming device, it can be their heating system, heating and cooling system, but also their electric vehicles or energy-intensive industries with their industrial processes, when possible, without undermining the industrial output. Can actually and should actually, when possible, flexibly adjust their consumption in order to integrate the variable renewable generation so that there is a matching. The problem is that consumers are not exposed to these external signals from the system that will allow them to adjust their consumption. Then on top of the mere consumption, consumer can also deploy the decentralized small-scale batteries or even use the batteries on wheels of their electric vehicles. That's also another way to store the abundant renewable generation and then eventually use that on site when the electricity prices are high or when there is a scarcity of renewable in the system. But it's extremely important to look at all these decentralized capability of consumers to contribute to that integration. There is a risk, and I conclude, when looking at storage. And I'm looking in particular at my country, Italy, but also Germany, to still look at very centralized but expensive way to integrate variable renewables through large-scale, utility-scale storage solution. In Italy, for example, there is a 16 billion state aid scheme approved by the European Commission to support utility-scale storage solution to help integrate variable renewables. Are we sure that this is the most cost-effective way of spending public money to integrate variable renewables? Shouldn't we consider instead using and activating the distributed flexibility potential of all consumers? That's
Michael,
a rhetoric question.
Thank you very much. It's also a literal question that someone in the Q&A has pointed towards. This person, who doesn't give their name, asks, what can citizens do to accelerate the greening of energy systems? Thomas, what is your view on that? You know, what's the role for consumers here, but also what can be done to make sure consumers are enabled and can actually afford to play a role in the energy system?
So it's an important question because the fact of the matter is that consumers have a very small margin for maneuver when it comes to doing anything that relates to what we're talking about here. Virtually 100% of Europeans already consume electricity to some extent. If you want to go for electric heating, the first thing that you need to be able to do is to actually own the place where you live. So obviously it's different depending on one country to another, but around a third of the Europeans actually do not own the place where they live. And so for the consumers that are renting the flat or the home where they live, their capacity of switching to heat pump is literally zero because they can't legally make that decision. And as someone who has been renting different flats over my life, I can tell you that most homeowners are not, let's say, looking at this with a keen eye, because obviously you have the classic split incentive between the landlord and the tenant. For people that happen to be landlords, then people that are owning the place where they live, then the question obviously is, what is the capacity to change? Do you have access to the information? Do you have access to, and most of that information, to be clear, is information that is word to mouth. So about people that have done, neighbors, family, friends that have some experience with switching to electricity, whether through an electric car or a heat pump. Besides the information, obviously, there is the financing challenge. And what I urge everyone to do is to follow the advice by the economist Jean Pisani-Ferry, who said that, yes, we need to talk in billions of euros, of course, like Ember does. That's 100% relevant. I'm not going to discuss that. But we also need to consider the microeconomic challenge. And here we need to talk of month of revenues of investment by the household we're talking about. So if you take, let's say, a typical European family, obviously that does not exist, except in my mind, but a typical family would have 3,000, 4,000 euros of revenue per month. So two people put together 3,000 to 4,000. For that family, buying a heat pump that costs 20K, that's 5 months of revenue that they need to pull. And so here you have a financing challenge. In an ideal world, each private bank will be doing its job and providing cheap loans for heat pumps like they do for people who want to buy a new car. But that's not the world where we live in. And that's where we need to have stronger public intervention. When it comes to households, obviously, the more regional, the more local, the better, in order to create public-private partnership, especially with private banks, to make sure that middle-class families can actually invest in heat pumps, but also in electric cars. But if you do a heat pump plus an electric car, you're quickly at 1 year of revenue, which is a significant economic challenge for European families.
Thank you, Thomas. That's a really important point on the affordability challenge for households. Sylvia, we've had a question about data centers. Alice Jacome, or Jassome, sorry, Alice, if I've mangled your last name. She asks, is there an EU strategy to address the potential massive increase in energy demand from data centers? What's your view, Sylvia, on what's coming in terms of additional energy demand here, and also how's that going to pressure the grid?
Yeah, from the grid's perspective, the solution that has already been identified in the revision of the electricity market design and also in the EU action plan for grids is anticipatory investments that are going to become a reality. This means the need to invest in an anticipatory way when it is expected that new connection, both from the supply side and also from the demand side, and so we come to data center, will materialize in a certain area in a certain period of time. Because when this happens, the grid must be there, because the developments of the different technologies have different time to market. So grids must move, let's say, in advance. And so the solution would be really anticipatory investments.
Okay, thank you. Very clear answer. Chris, we have a question from an anonymous audience member who asks, how much did the solar and wind growth in 2019 to 2024 cost? I guess they're thinking there about how much the investments were compared with those massive savings in the displaced fossil fuel imports that you mentioned.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. I completely understand the thinking behind the question of wanting to compare these two costs, but I think I would just say that the way I see it, these costs are quite fundamentally different and difficult to compare, because the costs that are being spoken around wind and solar actually should be seen as investments. These are investments into assets that will provide low-cost energy for 25 or more years. So yes, they were invested in and built in this time period in the last 5 years, but they'll provide energy for much longer than that. Whereas the fossil fuel import costs that were avoided, they would have been, one-off costs. You import fossil fuels, you burn them once they're gone, you have to go back and import some more. So I think it's while it might be tempting to compare those two costs, I think it's not really a fair comparison. Because like I said, this investment in wind and solar power is more like an investment in the future.
Thanks, Chris. Mark, we've had another question sort of comparing renewable energy and fossil fuels. This person asks, are renewable energy projects profitable enough today to shift investments away from fossil fuels?
I think they are. I mean, developers are commercial organizations. They're not state-owned entities. So hugely focused, your utilities and developers are hugely focused on things like IRR, accretion. The utilities will normally bring in financial partners who are even more focused on IRR and returns. And I think it's true that they are. I think there are also constraints on where you may put capital. Many banks and investors may not be able to invest in fossils, which is another factor that's at play. I think the challenge here is that financing costs have gone up. There is a little bit of indigestion, shall we say, because it's not just financing, it's capital costs. There are some projects which were, won when financing was less expensive, and they now have to be executed when the costs are higher, i.e. when they won the projects, they were not able to fix down costs. And those are high profile ones which have maybe struggled with the very high levels of return. But I think, look, we're encouraged by the returns we see in the market at the moment.
Okay, so a positive outlook there. Alfredo, a question for you about geopolitics and the wind sector. How do you think changing geopolitics will affect the wind sector in the EU in the next few years? Are we likely to see the EU or European companies partnering with more overseas countries such as China on wind and solar projects?
Thank you very much for the question, and I think quite a hot one these days. I mean, first of all, it's fair to start saying that we are already collaborating a lot with China. I think in this question we all look at China mainly as a main topic, but we are already collaborating and working a lot with Chinese companies. Now we think about all the components we integrate in wind turbines. We think about PV panels, batteries, you name it. No, the collaboration is quite dense and intense. I think what we need to look at going forward is a few things. There's a security element that we need to bring into the equation that is extremely important right now. We can think about energy security, but also about cyber security. And that's going to bring a dimension that we need to address in any collaboration with partners. The second element, most of the technologies we're talking about here have been designed, created in Europe, and Europe has played a leading role in many of those technologies. In the case of wind turbine, it's clear. Wind energy was invented in Denmark, and from there conquered the world. No, and now China plays a big role. But the point I want to make, there is a role for EU to keep this technology leadership, to keep developing the technology where we can lead, and that must be supported. And last element is jobs, of course. So in all these partnerships, we need to keep jobs in Europe. The question is related to partnership, and that's how I want to conclude. Partnership remains what it is, partnership. So it means that there is a dimension of levelized playing field. We have the same rules on both sides. And second, must be a win-win kind of collaboration. And then everybody can start thinking along those lines.
Alfredo, thank you. We'll end on a win-win. Then we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you very much to the team from Ember and to our panelists for sharing your insights with us. I encourage everyone in the audience to read the Ember European Electricity Review. It's available on their website at ember-energy.org. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.